Okay, so I was scheduled to be the final speaker. We are kind of pushing up later into the session, so I'm gonna give my comments, but I'm gonna kind of cut them down and try to be as brief as I can. And then we'll have time for a Q&A period afterwards. So I'm going to, in many ways, my comments are similar to some of what Radhika in particular raised. I think there was I'm going to begin just briefly with how I understand imperialism as the definitive contradiction of capitalism as a world system, right? So I think many of the things that Radhika said, I would agree with. In terms of thinking about imperialism as a system structured, as the Benaics have argued, as enabling a drain of wealth, a drain of value from periphery to core, right? This often happens through the cheapening of labor in peripheral countries and through the extraction, obviously, undervalued resources from periphery of core, and something that Nina had mentioned, the destruction of the productive forces in the periphery. And so this has been really core to the operation of capitalism since its inception, right? This has been a really core contradiction there. But underneath the capacity to appropriate value, to drain wealth from the periphery of the world system to the core, underneath this, I think, and this is really fundamental to imperialism, is this distinction between who can be sovereign and who is denied sovereign capacity. Right now, so the question of sovereignty is really central, in my view, to understanding an imperialist versus an anti-imperialist world system, right? So in an imperialist system, the integration of peripheral states into, let's say, what I think Radhika very nicely denigrated as globalization as a capitalist ideology, but as the form in which peripheral states are integrated into trade, into international institutions, is of a sort that their participation is oriented towards the development of the core, not towards their internal development. But this is only possible if those states themselves do not have the degree of power and force necessary to assert sovereign control over their resources. And imperialism does this. And here I'm going to go to Samir Amin, right? Samir Amin, I think in the same essay Matteo had cited, speaks of imperialism walking on two legs. And he also speaks of the need, therefore, of anti-imperialism to walk on two legs. So this denial of sovereignty that imperialism imposes proceeds through two legs, an economic leg and a military leg. And I'm going to try to emphasize both and the dialectic between the both, and how they're sometimes in tension with one another, both in terms of imperialism and anti-imperialism, right? So obviously violence seems quite central and evident in the sense that sovereignty can be denied through the application of greater force, right? Through the compulsion of greater military force that can force peoples and states and political authorities to orient themselves towards the more dominant military power. Economic leg, Amin argues, Samir Amin is really arguing that this is something that's really pivotal to understanding the contemporary moment. The economic leg is achieved through the monopoly power over capital, but especially over, let's say, the core technologies of capital, right? So we see a lot of discussions today around semiconductor chips and sanctions around that. So the denial of sovereignty is also enforced through monopoly over the principal means of production, right? So you might even have some levels of industrialization in the periphery, but the core technologies continue to be owned on a monopoly basis by the imperial powers. So these are the two legs that Samir Amin will argue that imperialism will walk on to force peripheral states to integrate into the system in ways that underdevelop their societies and develop core states. There is potentially a third leg that we might want to add to this discussion, which is the ideological leg that others have mentioned. And I think the left very often can fall into, maybe in losing sight of those two primary legs, economic and military, that ideological leg. And they often fall into what I have termed the Las Casas paradigm, right? In the way in which one of the early critiques of imperialism from the 16th century with the Las Casas, he argued for a recognition of indigenous peoples without recognizing their right to sovereignty. He wanted a recognition of their culture, of their knowledge, of their ways of life, even to go to something Radhika said, even a redistribution of wealth to a limited extent, right? Without actually threatening the sovereignty of Spanish imperialism over indigenous peoples, right? So the key question is sovereign reclamation. So how is this to be achieved? It has to be achieved on both the economic, military, and I guess the ideological leg, which I'll try to conclude with in about 5 minutes. So I think the case par excellence of anti-imperialism, or one of them of the 20th century, is the revolution in China, the People's Republic of China, spearheaded by the Communist Party of China, right? Now, this is obviously a revolution in which the question of force and violence was pivotal, where the Chinese Revolution effectively demonstrated, even before the Vietnamese Revolution, contemporaneous with the Korean War, a capacity to do what Fanon said was integral to anti-imperialism, is to return to imperialism a greater violence than that which it imposes on the peripheries. Now, of course, this doesn't sound maybe so nice to romantic and idealized decolonial ears, right, where we're supposed to kind of hold hands and sing our way to anti-imperial liberation. But we have to remember this was Fanon's imperative as well. So the revolution in China, through force, is able to then put in place the economic leg, right? So because there is not the same compromises that are happening, maybe that happened through the Gandhian politics in India, there's an ability to impose a different regime of property in China, vis-a-vis land reform, vis-a-vis nationalization, that enable the structural foundation for a form of economic development that Radhika was pointing towards, right? To generate domestic capital that can overcome dependence on the core through a process like land reform and nationalization. And so, although this was premised on, in the last instance, force, of course, Mao's famous dictum, as time went on, it became clear, even in China, that there was only so far that this approach could take China in addressing the deficit of capital and technology in order to continue to build power that can hold off imperialist counter-revolution. So of course, we know China then in the 1980s takes a different approach, where perhaps there's a compromise on the military leg, or let's say the leg of force, right? Where maybe China starts to integrate into the economic system in order to build more capital, to build more of that economic leg, economic power, which has had incredible outcomes. So we see the Chinese experience of an economic anti-imperialism through which it has been able to integrate into global markets, but to do so in service of its own internal development. But in doing so, it has maybe compromised on, at times, a military strategy of challenging Western capitalist military power in the 1980s or 90s, maybe going along more with certain military projects, right? But we can see the need, the strategic need, and in the end, by the 2000s, China has generated a level of economic development and a reappropriation of global surpluses that it can recycle into the global South and into the non-Western world, which has incredible dividends, which comes to be very threatening to Western capitalism. But here, Western capitalism, because it cannot compete with China on the economic leg, it returns to the military leg, right? And we see this, and we have to keep in mind, in many ways, the war in Ukraine is directed at China, right? We hear a lot of it being directed at Russia, but where I will point to people, and I've pointed this before, is in 2005, when it became clear to the United States that China had something to offer, not just to the global South, but to Europe. We have to remember in 2005, France and Germany were looking at the United States as a really irrational actor, right? There was a way in which China was seen as having something to offer that the US couldn't. And at this moment, Robert Kaplan writes an essay called How We Would Fight China. So of course, Robert Kaplan isn't the be all and end all, but it is kind of indicative of a certain trajectory in the US foreign policy establishment. And in this essay, and I'm going to read this quote, I've done this before, but it's just so telling. This is where you can see the United States returning to this military leg in its attempt to contain Chinese economic anti-imperialism. Kaplan argues, and this is where he's trying to argue that NATO is central to the US war on China, right? Kaplan argues that NATO is ours to lead, unlike the increasingly powerful European Union, whose own defense force, should it become a reality, would inevitably emerge as a competing regional power, one that might align itself with China in order to balance against us. NATO and an autonomous European defense force cannot both prosper. Only one can, and we should want it to be the former, NATO, so that Europe is a military asset for us, not a liability, as we confront China. So we can see the way in which wars were instigated in the 2000s to bring Europe back on side with NATO. We can see the wars in Syria, in Libya, the promotion of AFRICOM. In many ways, you know, AFRICOM, Kaplan in the essay talks about PACOM, Pacific Command, not an African command, as a means to contain China's growing economic power to be able to offer the global South in particular a different form of economic development. And so this military leg, though, whether it's the overthrow of the Libyan government or the attempt to overthrow in Syria, in Ukraine, these are threatening China's economic project, right? So I think then as far as China has gone, the capacity of Hezbollah, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, the capacity of Russia to be able to intervene in Syria at the moment that it did in Ukraine in 2014, this was a response to that military leg, right? And I think we see a lot of the rising anti-imperialism in the Middle East, for example, where we have, whether it's a group like Hezbollah defeating Zionism or the Palestinian National Liberation Movement that keeps getting stronger by returning a greater violence to colonialism, imperialism, those movements are recognizing that core to their success is the broader victory of anti-imperialism, right? That say, suppose, for example, Palestinian armed movements will not succeed without the backing of Iran. And for Iran to succeed, however, even though China has not been active militarily, its capacity to help Iran withstand sanctions has been core to these national liberation movements in the region. So I'm just trying to emphasize this dialect, this link between the economic and military leg, as we've seen playing out, that both seem to have been necessary, even if one state, maybe Russia or Iran, has been more explicitly confronting Western capitalism at a military scale. They are subject to economic sanctions that China's economic power can withstand. And then I think China's capacity to continue with this development is often necessarily dependent upon the capacity of military resistance in key regions in the world. And so I'll just conclude, what does that mean for those of us in the core? I think several elements here. Number one, then it's very clear, how do we walk on both of these legs? For those of us, I mean, not everybody perhaps here is in the core, but one is, I think, the incredible work being done that Nina is co-chair of. I was very honored to be invited to join, and I know others have as well, in terms of the People's Tribunal on Sanctions, is to link working class organization to opposition to sanctions, which is an attempt to weaken the economic leg of anti-imperialism, right? So to continue the work to build popular opposition to the sanctions regime is pivotal, and to oppose in whatever capacity possible the military-industrial regime in these countries. So we see direct action like groups like Palestine Action shutting down weapons factories in the UK. I know they have also factories in the United States and elsewhere, but to continue to build opposition to there. And then the ideological leg is to make sure that we fight against the confusions that Radhika and others have spoken about, the attempts to confuse the imperialism of Western capitalism tries to represent itself as an anti-imperialism, as an anti-racist project, to fight against that, to have clarity as to what's at stake in these conflicts. So I will stop my comments there, and we can open it up to questions and answers.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.